Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
To be not only in prison, but in a high secure prison for a crime that you know you didn't commit, and spend all of that time subject to those conditions, it's unthinkable. It's unimaginable for everybody.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking, they still haunt our imaginations.
This is the story of a 68-year-old man who spent 38 years in jail for a crime he didn't commit. Peter Sullivan had his murder conviction quashed at the Court of Appeal in May 2025. In the last episode, we explored how, in 1987, he was wrongly convicted of the frenzied murder of 21-year-old florist and part-time barmaid Diane Sindall. It was alleged that in August 1986, Sullivan had spent the day drinking heavily after losing a darts match and went out armed with a crowbar before a chance encounter with Diane. She was beaten to death and sexually assaulted, her body left partially clothed and mutilated. Sullivan has always protested his innocence, and lawyers had tried twice before to get his conviction overturned. In this episode, Martin speaks exclusively to Peter Sullivan's solicitor about the breakthrough in this case, the impact of long years of wrongful imprisonment, and the lessons that can be learned for other miscarriages of justice in Britain, and there seem to be many. Martin, let's start with the Court of Appeal ruling. What changed after all these decades that allowed Sullivan to finally be exonerated?
Essentially, there were new tests ordered by the Criminal Cases Review Commission, and they revealed that Sullivan's DNA wasn't present on semen samples that had been preserved from Diane Sindall's body at the time. Now, Duncan Atkinson KC, for the Crown Prosecution Service, told the Court of Appeal that analysis of the DNA now showed it came from someone else, someone referred to as unknown male 1, and that it was 1 billion times more likely that that sample originated from unknown male 1 rather than someone else, and it certainly did not match Peter Sullivan. The prosecutor said, quote, "Had this DNA evidence been available at the time a decision was taken to prosecute, it is difficult to see how a decision to prosecute could have been made." That was enough for the appeal judges. The main judge, Lord Justice Holroyd, then quashed the conviction, saying, quote, "In the light of that evidence, it is impossible to regard the appellant's conviction as safe."
So just thinking, Martin, was that DNA evidence not available then at the original trial?
The DNA evidence was available, but it wasn't possible to test it in the same way that it was. We've talked about this in the past in other cases, that DNA technology moves very, very quickly. And 38 years on, there were new techniques that could look much more precisely and identify individuals from that DNA, or in this case, certainly rule out Peter Sullivan. But simply the application of forensic science really wasn't available at the time of the conviction.
What about Peter Sullivan himself? Was he at the Court of Appeal to hear this ruling?
He was there in a sense, not in body. He watched it all from his prison in Wakefield. He was on a video link, which is often the case these days. He listened with his head down and his arms folded. He appeared to weep and put his hand to his mouth at that crucial point, the point that his conviction was quashed. As the judgment was read out, his sister Kim, who was in court and was in tears, she shouted, "We've done it." Outside court, she was a bit more measured. She said, "We lost Peter for 39 years, and at the end of the day, it's not just us. Peter hasn't won, And neither has the Sindall family. They've lost their daughter. They are not going to get her back.
That's rather lovely that the sister Kim made a nod to the Sindall family as well, and I suppose suggesting that they're very much victims in this story too.
I think that's always the measure of somebody who, even at an ecstatic moment like this, still has retained sympathy for the victim. You perhaps imagine that somebody would just leap for joy and just dwell on their own final good fortune. But in the case of her family and Peter Sullivan himself, they were very measured in what they said and didn't lose sight of the fact that there was at the heart of this case a victim and a victim's family who are still looking for answers.
And Peter Sullivan himself gave a statement which I think he issued through his lawyer, didn't he, Sarah Myatt?
He did, and it was a rather moving one. It was full of good grace and quiet acceptance, despite the long years of unjust imprisonment. This is what Peter said, quote, "As God is my witness, it is said the truth shall take you free. It is unfortunate," he went on, "that it does not give a timescale as we advance towards resolving the wrongs done to me. I am not angry, I am not bitter. I am simply anxious to return to my loved ones and family, as I've got to make the most of what is left of the existence I'm granted in this world." Quite poetic at moments.
Well, he'd had a long time to think about it as well, hadn't he, if he'd been in prison all that time. And just wondering, what kind of shape is he in at 68? Is he a fit man? Is he a well man? And can he take advantage of the years he has left?
I don't know precisely what his health is like. Sarah Myatt, the solicitor, is very reluctant to talk in any detail about that, but he certainly can't be as well or as fit as he would be if he hadn't spent all those years in prison. You can judge from the few words that he said that he sees that he's got a future ahead of him, but he has no idea, like any of us, I suppose, how long that future is going to be. But he's determined to enjoy it. But I think you can only imagine what it must be like coming out into a world that he must barely recognise.
And also interesting that he says he's not angry and he's not bitter. That's a sign of a big character, Martin, to say that after all those years being locked away when you didn't do the crime you've been accused of.
I think there must be moments when he got angry and he got bitter. But I think if you've just been told that you are now finally a free man, I think it's perhaps an opportunity to be magnanimous.
You interviewed his lawyer in an exclusive for True Criminals. Tell me a bit about what she said.
Yeah, I got a fascinating insight from her into the convoluted appeals process in the UK, some of which I knew already, but talking to her specifically about the battle that she faced to get to his release was very interesting. We talked about the speed of reviews, the lack of flexibility in the system, and the importance of bringing new evidence, above all, new DNA technology, especially, and this is where it gets quite detailed, the key to this was the Y-STR, the Y chromosome short tandem repeat DNA method on old contested cases.
Well, you're going to have to expound on that. What is Y-STR in layman's terms?
I'll expand as much as I can. We should have brought in a scientist, perhaps, to explain in more detail. But look, in essence, the Y-STR amplifies the male-specific Y chromosome markers in DNA samples. And why that's important is that it allows scientists to extract partial DNA profiles where samples are old or DNA has been degraded. That's about as scientific as I and the solicitor Sarah Myatt get.
Well, let's take a listen to the interview you did with Sarah.
Hello, Sarah. Welcome to True Criminals. Thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to start by asking, where's Peter now and how is he?
I can tell you that he's doing really well. In terms of where he is, I'm afraid I can't say. He wants to stay private and just have some time to be left alone. But I do speak to him regularly and he is doing really well.
On release from prison, he spoke of the horrors that he'd faced. From what he's told you about his time in prison, how was it? How did he deal with it?
I think in his statement, he said that he didn't want to go into what he'd experienced over those 38 years. But I think everybody can take some time to think about just how that would have been to be not only in prison, but in a high secure prison for a crime that that you know you didn't commit and spend all of that time subject to those conditions, it's unthinkable, isn't it? It's unimaginable for everybody.
How did you first get involved in Peter's case?
I joined Sweetolski's in 2005, and by 2007 I was involved in Peter's case. Initially, just having a look at the appeal that was ongoing for him, and then very quickly after that, I started to represent Peter for his parole board reviews. We had prison law department then, so I represented him when he appeared before the parole board. And that was really when I became quite heavily involved in when I say in his case, I don't particularly mean his appeal at that point, but that's when I had the majority of the contact with him to start with.
And why did you take it on?
I think for me, because I had represented him before the parole board and I knew that he was very clearly saying, I did not commit this crime. And that has a direct impact on whether he can be successful before the parole board or not. And I'd seen that from him, that clear determination of, I just didn't do this. And that really hit home, because he knew that that would impact on his ability to not only to progress through the prison system, but to be able to then be successful before the parole board as well.
Did you ever, in those early stages, have any doubts about Peter's innocence?
I never did. I really don't say that lightly. I'm an experienced criminal defence solicitor. You deal with people quite often telling you I didn't commit this crime, and part of my role is to put that forward. But I don't say this lightly, and I don't say this naively, that I just never doubted what he was saying to me.
Let's talk a bit about your engagement with the Criminal Cases Review Commission.
We've always had contact with them going through, and I know that it's a process that can take a long time. And when you look back, it is a long time, but there is always work going on within that time. And we've always had a lot of good communication from the CCRC, updates and so on as to what work was being undertaken. Things obviously then massively took off when the case was referred by them last November.
Can you describe the moment that you heard the news that the DNA had shown that Peter couldn't have been the killer?
Oh, it was a moment that will stay with me forever. I was in the office. I received a phone call from the CCRC to say that the DNA results had come back and that they were not a match with Peter. That was just groundbreaking. It was amazing. You can never guarantee anything. It has to go through the process and go through the court systems. So there's never any guarantee. It's not our decision to make, but that was the key piece of evidence that we'd been waiting for.
In 2008, the CCRC, in its review of the case, rejected the chance to do new DNA testing, claiming it was futile. Why do you think it said that?
Well, back then, expert opinion had been sought, and the opinion of the experts was that the testing would not provide a full profile. And in fact, if that testing had been carried out anyway, the samples would have been destroyed and we wouldn't be in the position that we're in now.
Do you think this method of DNA testing, the Y-STR method, can you talk us through the process, perhaps in layman's terms, for Y-STR DNA testing that was done this time and the result that it produced should be used to re-examine other pre-1990s sexual assault cases?
I think that science now has evolved so much compared to how things were many years ago. We take DNA nowadays to be quite routine, almost. There's a crime scene, swabs are taken, samples are gathered, and they are all tested for DNA, and it's commonplace now. But it wasn't available years ago. And I think that that is something that, in particular cases, there may be scope for that to be considered.
Sometimes the police have just 24 hours to gather enough information to charge someone who they believe has committed a serious crime. Could you gather enough information on motive, means and opportunity before the time runs out? If If you're fascinated by true crime, then join us in June 2025 for CrimeCon London. Meet the biggest names in true crime TV, experience live forensic demonstrations, and dive deep into the criminal mind with your favourite authors, podcasters, and content creators. From cold case reviews to immersive sessions with crime scene experts and police dogs, this is your chance to be part of the UK's biggest true crime event. Go to crimecon.co.uk now to secure your tickets. CrimeCon London, partnered by True Crime Channel, June 7th and 8th, 2025. The clock is ticking. Find out more and secure your place now at crimecon.co.uk.
How will history judge American President Donald Trump?
If they don't kiss the ring, they are our enemy.
Podcast Creating History takes stock, with insights from historian David Reynolds on Trump's unconventional, unpredictable, and always controversial reset of international relations.
I win, you lose. That's what deals are about.
Listen to Creating History wherever you get your podcasts.
Looking at similar cases of men who've served years in prison for crimes they didn't commit, and I'm thinking here of Victor Neelan, wrongfully convicted of attempted rape, and especially Andrew Malkinson, wrongfully convicted of rape. Do you think the CCRC is fit for purpose?
I don't want to comment on the CCRC and taking a position of criticism against them.
Many people are struck by how very slowly the review and the appeals processes move. The CCRC and the courts repeatedly dismiss DNA pleas until there's media pressure on a case. What do you think can be done to make those processes go faster?
I think it is something where you could look at and think that a particular case needs to be expedited if the evidence is there and it's clear cut. That said, there is a process to go through, and I think to the outside world sometimes the legal process seems an unknown, and you can think, well, like in Peter's case, his case was referred in November and we had the actual appeal hearing only last week. But there is still work ongoing during that time. Could there be a faster process if somebody's case is quite blatant? But yes. But there is still a legal process to go through during that time.
The other big issue here is the issue of sentencing and the role of the Parole Board. Peter Sullivan was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum sentence of 15 years, but he served 38 because he continued to protest his innocence. And similarly, this is one of the other cases I've just mentioned, postman Victor Neelan was mistakenly convicted of attempted rape and released in 2013. He'd spent 17 years in jail, 10 years more than his recommended tariff, because he too didn't admit guilt. The Parole Board has stated that it had no choice but to proceed on the basis that Mr. Sullivan was rightly convicted. And it goes on, if a prisoner is denying their guilt, that is one part of a comprehensive risk assessment that the panel will conduct.
You're absolutely right in what you say. The Parole Board have to deal with a prisoner as somebody who has been rightly convicted, because their role is not to look at whether that conviction was right or not. That's not what they're there for. They look at, as you say, a risk assessment, and part of that risk assessment, and the significant part of it, is whether somebody has accepted responsibility and then following that undertake an offence-related work to address the issues of why that offence was committed, to demonstrate a reduction in risk. And you almost get to a stalemate situation where a prisoner is saying, I didn't commit this offence. And that means that that prisoner can then not address the reasons why that offence happened, because what they're saying is it never happened in the first place, or they weren't the one to commit it. And that does put in difficulty the risk assessment, because how do you assess somebody's risk in those circumstances? When you look at a case like Peter, well, surely the Parole Board at some point could say, well, he's not going to change, his position's not going to change. So let's have a look at his other risk factors and see whether they are low enough to direct release. But we have to be mindful that the Parole Board would then, I think, fall under criticism that they weren't considering prisoners as people who had been rightly convicted, because that's not their role to look at the conviction.
Should it be part of the risk assessment, the fact that somebody continues many, many years after their minimum tariff, they continue to deny their guilt?
Yes, I'm certainly not saying it wasn't a frustrating situation. Of course it is. This is a man who spent years in custody post-tariff because he could never make any progress in that regard. And that is a very frustrating situation. But I just don't think the Parole Board can approach that in any other way.
So what happens now? And how easily is Peter adapting to a world that he must barely recognise?
It will, of course, take some time. It undoubtedly will. He's had such a long period of time in custody, and the world has changed quite significantly during that time. When we think of things that we take for granted, technology, the use of mobile phones and everything in that sense, he's not just adapting to his freedom, but the world as it is now, which is very different to as it was back in 1987.
Peter's due compensation, and there's been speculation that he could be due to be paid up to £1 million, although I suppose even £1 million doesn't really sound adequate for all those lost years. But it's not automatic, is it?
Yes, you're right. It's not automatic. It has to be an application. And we are at the early stages, of course, with Peter. But I've obviously seen the news reports relating to Mr. Malkinson and the difficulties that he's had, along with others as well. Of course, the Solskis are still representing him in terms of that application. And as you say, I can't imagine any sum that could adequately compensate for the loss of the amount of years that Peter has lost.
You and he still have a fight on your hands, don't you?
My understanding is that it's certainly not a quick process.
And how's all this affected you? You've been jettisoned into the limelight from, forgive me, but many years of relative obscurity, I'd say, but certainly nothing like this before on a national scale. How have you coped with it?
I've certainly had to very quickly get comfortable with dealing with media and interviews and being on TV and things like that. It's certainly been a very drastic change to my normal day-to-day working life that was quite quiet and no media involvement at all. But it's been an experience for me.
And congratulations on your success with Peter's case, but do you have any similar cases up your sleeve?
I haven't actually. We as a firm now don't undertake routine appeal work. It's a very standalone case, and it's because of the length of time we've been involved with him that we've seen this through to the end, thankfully. We will always consider any case at the root of our work. We want to help people. We want to help people who do not ordinarily have a voice or might be struggling in some way to get their thoughts heard. I have had a number of inquiries already, as you can probably imagine, and I will look at and consider each and every one.
Sarah, it's been fascinating talking to you. Congratulations again on an astonishing success.
Thank you very much. Certainly the best outcome, and that's at the root of everything, isn't it? That Peter's now had his freedom.
Peter and his family must owe you so much. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, a fascinating insight from the inside of a criminal appeals process. It begs so many questions about our justice system, Martin.
Yes, the system failed multiple times. Courts rubber-stamped a flawed conviction. The Parole Board was stuck with its own protocols, and the CCRC, the Criminal Cases Review Commission, ignored parallels to cases like that of Victor Neelan, who was exonerated using the same Y-STR DNA technique. And of course there's Andrew Malkinson, a very high-profile miscarriage of justice case, and the controversy of his battle with the CCRC. It twice rejected his case. Eventually it led to an apology from the CCRC itself, and then a report by a lawyer, Chris Henley KC, which called for a review of many CCRC cases where DNA possibilities might exist. And at the end of all this, the CCRC chair was forced to resign.
And I'm not asking you for a scientific view on this, but it's remarkable to me that these DNA samples survive 4 decades to be even retested. And that's quite extraordinary. And if they didn't, this release would never have happened.
Many, many years ago, I think at the start of the initial application of DNA technology in criminal cases, it was recognised that things would develop. And even if you couldn't employ the current techniques at the time, there was a great sense that techniques would improve, and it was valuable, crucial perhaps, to maintain those samples. But of course, when you go back to those samples and test, you remove a little bit of it. So you rather hope that whatever samples you do retain, there's quite a bit of it that might have to withstand several applications.
The other thought that struck me in your interview with Sarah was just how the system grinds through its motions so slowly and laboriously.
Even when the CCRC was persuaded to send Peter Sullivan's case to the appeal court, it still took 6 months for the hearing. The wheels of justice always turn very slowly. Another thing that I've recognised over my many years of covering criminal cases, you have to wonder how many more Peter Sullivans are sitting today in cells while real killers are walking free. Now, that lawyer, Chris Henley, KC, who reviewed the Malkinson case, said it was absolutely inevitable there will be more cases like Peter Sullivan's where prosecutions were based on circumstantial evidence or eyewitnesses or, as in Peter's case, dubious confessions.
All these years on, Martin, I guess Diane Sindall's murder is a cold case in many ways. The family thought the killer was in jail and perhaps got some kind of comfort or peace from the fact that whoever did this to Diane was behind bars. What are Merseyside police doing, if anything, all these years on to try to find Diane Sindall's actual killer?
They are doing a lot. In fact, they've been back onto the case for the last couple of years. They reopened it in June 2023 when it first emerged from the CCRC that the DNA recovered at the scene was not a match for Peter Sullivan. So irrespective of what was to come in the appeal courts, that was the trigger for Merseyside police to start the cold case. But finding the real killer after almost 4 decades will present a major challenge for the detectives. They've already screened and ruled out something like 260 suspects, including Miss Sindall's family and her fiancé. They've been unable to find a match in the national database for the DNA samples that were taken from Miss Sindall's body, which they're certain is that of the killer. So whoever the killer is, his or her, but most likely his DNA, does not exist on today's DNA database.
And if they do find the right person, they may not even be alive. There are so many questions that this kicks up. I just feel really sorry for Diane's family that they're left with no answers. I'm sure they're pleased that the miscarriage of justice has been sorted out, but it must be really awful for them. And until her killer is found, if her killer is even found, this case remains another open sore for British justice, doesn't it?
It does. There is no end to the case for Diane's family. How will it end? How will it be solved? Well, there are a number of possibilities. It may depend on the killer being arrested for something else and his DNA taken, which would then flag up on the system, the DNA database system, and alert the murder squad who've reopened this cold case. That would be the simplest way of solving it.
And of course, Martin, the thought that the real killer over these years has watched the headlines that we talked about in The Sun calling the killer a monster and seen the wrong person go to jail, that just raises so many questions and thoughts in my mind about this.
It's an intriguing idea, isn't it, that the real killer followed the police investigation and must have been overwhelmed with relief, joy even, when he discovered that Peter Sullivan not only been arrested, but he'd been charged and then convicted for something that this other guy had done. And the idea that he had followed this very high-profile case every day in the newspapers as the trial unfolded is extraordinary. And I suppose it begs the question, having gone through all that and created a life for himself that he should never have got, is the real killer now going to feel any kind of remorse? Might he, if he's still alive, in his old age, begin to think that it was time to confess to the police?
I suspect the real killer will probably never make amends after all of these years. It's been almost 4 decades, but one wonders whether he suffers any remorse or guilt, first of all, for a brutal murder of a young 21-year-old on the eve of her new life with her fiancé, or indeed remorse or guilt for taking somebody else's life, because he took Peter Sullivan's too, didn't he?
He did. And you can only, I suppose, try and imagine that this was a man who may have gone on to have a family of his own. Who knows what became of his life? But if he is still alive, might he be persuaded to make amends? I don't know. I think it's highly unlikely. But there's always the possibility that he will have told somebody about what he did, particularly perhaps after the conviction of Peter Sullivan. And so there may be somebody who is harbouring that secret. And I've seen it happen in the past, that secret does emerge when the real killer dies. Somebody comes forward, and even if the killer wasn't prepared to admit his guilt, the person he shared that secret with has in the past come forward and told the police the truth of what happened.
Hey listeners, True Criminals is a new show and your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram at true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.